The Acts of Villisca, A True Crime. Part 1, The House on the Hill. June 9, 1912, Villisca, Iowa. The town of Villisca sat in the southwest corner of Iowa like a forgotten button on an old coat. 2,000 people lived there, give or take a few births and burials. Main Street ran straight through the middle, lined with brick storefronts, a hardware store, a dry goods emporium, 2 banks, a livery stable, and the Farmers Mercantile Company. There was a depot where the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad stopped twice daily. There was a water tower, 2 churches, a school, and a hotel called the American House that smelled of stale tobacco and floor wax. On the surface, Villisca was the kind of town that believed evil belonged to other places: Chicago, New York, St. Louis. But evil doesn't read train schedules. Evil doesn't care about church socials or corn futures. Evil came to Villisca on a warm Sunday night in June, and it arrived carrying an axe. The Moore family lived on the outskirts of town, on the east side of the tracks, in a white 2-story house that sat on a slight rise. It was a comfortable house, unremarkable from the street that a porch ran along the front, that a large maple tree shaded the yard. Inside, the floors were pine, worn smooth by years of stocking feet and children's games. The wallpaper was floral, roses, mostly, faded at the edges. Josiah B. Moore was 43 years old. Everyone called him Joe. That he was a man of medium height, solidly built, with a mustache that curled slightly at the ends and a receding hairline that he tried to ignore. He sold farm implements for the International Harvester Company, traveling by train through the surrounding counties, showing reapers and binders to farmers who smelled of hay and sweat. He was good at his job because he was honest, and farmers trusted honest men. That he made enough to keep his family comfortable. A Model T Ford in the carriage house, a piano in the parlor, new dresses for his wife when the seasons changed. His wife, Sarah, was 38. She had been Sarah Elizabeth Harris before she married, a farmer's daughter from nearby Clarinda. She had a round, pleasant face, brown hair pinned up in the fashion of the day, and hands that were never still, sewing, cooking, canning, sweeping. She was a Methodist, active in the church, and she sang alto in the choir. People said she had a gentle way about her, a softness that made children trust her and men mind their manners in her presence. The Moores had 4 children. Herman, 11, was the oldest, a serious boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's patience. He liked to read adventure stories and dreamed of one day seeing the ocean. Catherine, 10, was the only girl between the boys, her mother's helper, already learning to sew and bake. She had red hair that she hated and freckles that she hated more, but she smiled easily. Boyd, 7, was all boy. Dirty knees, skinned elbows, a collection of frogs in a tin can. Paul, 5, was the baby of the Moore family, still round-cheeked and soft, with a gap-toothed grin that could melt any adult heart. They were, by all accounts, a happy family. Not perfect, no family is, but happy. Joe worked hard. Sarah kept the home. The children went to school and said their prayers and squabbled over the last piece of pie. They were the kind of family that made Villisca proud. The Stillinger girls. On the night of June 9, 1912, the Moores had guests. Lena Stillinger and her younger sister Ina were staying overnight. Lena was 12, Ina 8. That they lived with their parents, Ross and Mary Stillinger, about half a mile away, but they often visited the Moore children. Lena was close to Catherine. They played dolls together and whispered secrets in the dark. Ina was a tag-along, tolerated by the older girls, adored by Paul and Boyd. The 2 girls had attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church that evening, just as the Moores had. The service had ended around 9:30. The night was warm, the sky clear, the stars coming out one by one like nails being driven into a dark board. Joe Moore walked home with his family and the Stillinger girls. He was carrying 5-year-old Paul on his shoulders. Sarah walked beside him, holding Boyd's hand. The older children ran ahead, chasing fireflies, their laughter carrying across the quiet street. No one saw anything unusual. N01 noticed a stranger lingering in the shadows near the depot. N01 heard footsteps following them at a careful distance. The house on 2nd Street. The Moore house at 508 East 2nd Street was not locked that night. Few houses in Villisca were. The town had one constable, a man named Hank Horton, who spent most of his nights sleeping in his chair with a shotgun across his lap. Crime in Villisca consisted of the occasional drunk and disorderly, a stray cow in a vegetable patch, maybe a stolen bicycle once a year. Locks were for cities. Locks said you didn't trust your neighbor. Joe lit the kerosene lamps in the parlor. Sarah put the children through their bedtime routine. Wash faces, brush teeth, say prayers. The girls shared one of the downstairs bedrooms, the front bedroom, with windows facing the street. The Moore boys slept in the upstairs east bedroom, a large room with 2 beds. Joe and Sarah had the upstairs west bedroom, overlooking the backyard. Lena and Ina Stillinger were given the downstairs front bedroom with Catherine. The 3 girls would share the bed. Lena later told investigators that she had trouble sleeping. The mattress was lumpy, she said, and the pillow smelled like lavender. She remembered hearing the clock on the mantel strike 11, but then she fell asleep. At some point, someone entered the house. We don't know exactly when. The coroner would later estimate the murders occurred between midnight and 2 a.m., based on the state of digestion of the victim's last meal. But that is guesswork, as most things in this case are guesswork. Here is what we know for certain. Someone came in through the back door. They may have used a tool to jimmy the lock, or they may have simply turned the knob. The door opened into the kitchen, a narrow room with a wood-burning stove and a pantry. The intruder moved through the kitchen and into the dining room, which connected to the parlor and the downstairs bedrooms. They were carrying an axe, not a hatchet, a full-sized axe, with a wooden handle about 18 inches long and a blade that had been sharpened to a razor's edge. The axe belonged to Joe Moore. He kept it in the carriage house, where he split kindling for the stove. The killer had retrieved it before entering the house, or perhaps after. The evidence is murky. What matters is that the killer knew where the axe was kept, or they searched until they found it. The downstairs front bedroom was the first stop. The girls. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. A double bed stood against the wall under the window. Catherine Moore, Lena Stillinger, and Ina Stillinger slept in that bed, tangled together as children do, limbs overlapping, one head on another's shoulder. The killer entered the room. They stood in the darkness, listening to the soft breathing of 3 sleeping girls. Then they raised the axe. The first blow struck Lena Stillinger. She was on the left side of the bed, closest to the door. The blade caught her square in the face, splitting her skull from forehead to jaw. She died instantly, or nearly so. The second blow was for Ina, the smallest of the 3, who may have woken for a fraction of a second before the axe came down. The third and fourth and fifth blows fell on Catherine Moore, who had red hair and freckles and dreamed of being a teacher someday. The killer did not stop when the girls were dead. They kept swinging. The medical examiner would later count dozens of wounds. The faces of all 3 girls were obliterated, so badly damaged that identification was made primarily by hair color and clothing. The axe was wielded with such force that the blade bit deep into the headboard of the bed, leaving gashes in the wood. After the girls were dead, the killer did something strange. They pulled the bedclothes up, covering the bodies. They placed each child's hands neatly across their chests, folded in a mockery of prayer. Then they closed the door and moved to the next room. The upstairs. The stairs creaked. The killer knew this. They must have known this, because they stepped carefully, placing their weight on the edges of the treads where the wood was strongest. Upstairs, the layout was simple. A hallway, the boys' room to the left, the parents' room to the right. Joe and Sarah Moore slept in their bed, Joe on the left, Sarah on the right. They had been reading before sleep. A copy of the Saturday Evening Post lay on the nightstand, open to a story about Theodore Roosevelt. The lamp had burned out hours ago. They lay on their backs, mouths slightly open, breathing the warm June air. The killer entered. The axe rose and fell. Joe Moore died first. The blow to his head was so powerful that it split his skull in 2, driving bone fragments into his brain. Sarah woke at the sound, a wet, cracking sound, like a hammer hitting a pumpkin. She may have screamed, but if she did, no one heard. The axe came down again, and again, and again. She threw her arms up to protect her face. The blade severed her left arm at the wrist. The next blow crushed her forehead. The killer struck Joe Moore at least 10 times. Sarah took nearly 20 blows. Their blood soaked the mattress, the pillows, the wallpaper, the ceiling. It pooled on the floor and dripped through the cracks into the dining room below, where it would later be found by the first person to enter the house. After the parents were dead, The killer covered their bodies with a sheet from the closet. They folded Joe's hands across his chest. They folded Sarah's hands, or what remained of them, across hers. Then they went to the boys' room. The boys, Herman, Boyd, and Paul Moore, slept in the east bedroom. Herman, 11, had his own bed near the window. Boyd and Paul, 7 and 5, shared the larger bed against the wall. The room was cluttered with boys' things: a baseball glove, a slingshot, a copy of Treasure Island with a cracked spine, a jar of fireflies that had long since suffocated. The killer entered. Herman woke first. He was a light sleeper. His mother always said he may have heard the thumps from his parents' room, the wet chopping sounds. He may have sat up in bed, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, just in time to see a figure in the doorway holding a dripping axe. The first blow caught Herman in the side of the head. He fell back onto his pillow. The killer struck him 4 more times, then turned to the younger boys. Boyd and Paul never woke up. The medical examiner would note that their eyes were closed when he examined them. The axe came down on Boyd first, then Paul. The blade was dulling now. The edge had rolled from striking so much bone, but it was still sharp enough to do its work. Boyd's skull was crushed in 3 places. Paul's, smaller and softer, was nearly severed. After the boys were dead, the killer performed the same ritual, pulling up the bedclothes, arranging the hands, placing a small blanket over Paul's face as if tucking him in. Then they left the room. The aftermath. The killer did not flee immediately. They spent time in the house after the murders, perhaps an hour, perhaps 2. They cleaned the axe with a towel from the kitchen, then placed the towel over the blade and set the axe on the back porch. They moved through the rooms, closing windows that had been open, lowering shades that had been raised. They extinguished the kerosene lamps, leaving the house in perfect darkness. They ate something from the kitchen. A plate of cookies sat on the counter. Several were missing. A glass of water had been poured and left on the dining room table. The killer had sat there, in the dark, drinking water and eating cookies, surrounded by the dead. They also used the bathroom. The toilet had been flushed and the seat left up, a detail that would later drive investigators to distraction. Then they left. They walked out the back door, crossed the yard, and disappeared into the Iowa night. The house sat silent on its hill, 8 bodies cooling under blood-soaked sheets, waiting for the morning. June 10, 1912, morning. The sun rose at 4:47 a.m. Villisca woke slowly. The depot agent unlocked the station. The baker fired his ovens. The banker walked to work, tipping his hat to Mrs. Patterson on the corner. No one noticed anything unusual about the Moore house. The curtains were drawn, which was normal for a summer morning. The yard was quiet. At 8 a.m., Joe Moore's brother-in-law, Ross Moore, stopped by the house. Joe had agreed to meet him at the hardware store at 7:30 to discuss a business matter. When Joe didn't show, Ross assumed he had overslept. He walked to the house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder, nothing. He tried the front door. It was locked. Unusual, but not impossible. That he walked around to the back. The back door was also locked. He peered through the kitchen window and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Dishes in the sink, a clean counter, a clock ticking on the wall. He went to the neighbor's house, a widow named Mary Peckham. She hadn't seen the Moores that morning. She hadn't heard anything unusual the night before. Ross walked back to the house, his unease growing into something colder. He forced the back door open. The lock splintered. He stepped into the kitchen. The first thing he noticed was the smell. It was a smell he would never forget for the rest of his life. A metallic, coppery stench, like rust and butcher paper, and something else, something sweet and rotten underneath. He walked through the kitchen into the dining room. The floor was wet. He looked down. His shoes were sticking to the floorboards. In the dim light, he couldn't tell what the liquid was. It looked like dark syrup, like molasses. He called out, "Joe? Sarah?" No answer. He walked to the front bedroom. The door was closed. He opened it. What he saw would break his mind. He would later tell investigators that he couldn't make sense of it at first. Just a tangle of blankets and dark stains, and something that looked like hair, but wasn't attached to anything. He closed the door. He walked back through the dining room, his shoes making sticky sounds. He climbed the stairs. He opened the door to the boys' room. And then Ross Moore ran. He ran out of the house, down the porch steps, across the yard, into the street. He ran until he reached the telephone exchange, where he collapsed against the counter and tried to form words. "Dead," he gasped. "They're all dead." Every last one of them. The operator asked who. The Moores, Ross said. The whole Moore family. Someone killed them all. End of part 1. Coming in part 2. The investigation begins. The town of Villisca descends into panic. A traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly becomes the prime suspect. And a mysterious man in a blue suit walks into the sheriff's office with a story that will haunt the case for a century.
There is no logic in what happened at Villisca, only patterns that don't quite fit. Looking at the evidence, something doesn't add up. I'm waiting for your thoughts.